welcome us all here to the Rector's Forum at All Saints Church. Welcome to all of you who are streaming with us online. My name is Mike Kinman. I'm the rector here. As always, this congregation is fueled by the grace of God, by the ministry of the people here, and by your generosity financially. And we are beginning our giving season here. If you have already made your pledge to All Saints Church for 2018, thank you so much. If you haven't yet, we really need you to do that. We always ask you to have conversations. If there are people in your life that you make financial decisions about, have those conversations. Listen for God's voice speaking to you through each other. And then go to God in prayer and ask God to put a number on your heart and then just write that number down. I am absolutely convinced if we all do those things, we're going to be just fine. And so please do that. And also right now, please give generously to support the mission and ministry of All Saints Church. And that means if you are streaming online, everyone turn around and wave at the camera. Wave to everyone streaming online. There's a donate button on your screen, and you can push that, and with your credit card or PayPal, make a gift to support the mission and ministry of All Saints Church. Will you pray with me, please? Oremos. Oh Dios, tú nos hiciste a tu propia imagen y nos redimiste por Jesús tu Hijo. Mira en tu compasión a toda la familia humana. Quita el odio y la arrogancia que nos corrompen el corazón. Derrumba las barreras que nos separan. Únenos en vínculos de amor. Y actúa a través de nuestra lucha y confusión a fin de cumplir tus propósitos en la tierra, para que a su debido tiempo todas las naciones y razas te sirvan en armonía alrededor de tu trono celestial, por Jesucristo nuestro Señor. Amen. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So this morning's forum is the first of two parts called Houselessness and Humanity. And first want to say a few words about the term houselessness. I first heard this term a few weeks ago. I was attending a local summit held by Bishop William Barber to prepare for his resurrection of Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign, which is going to be coming up next year. And we're going to be hearing more and more about that as May gets closer. We were meeting on a rooftop overlooking Skid Row, and one of the people there was Pete White, who is the founder of the Los Angeles Community Action Network. And I was hoping to have Pete here this morning, but he was unable to make his schedule work, so I get to kind of channel Pete for you. And Pete started talking not about homelessness, but about houselessness. And he pointed to the community on Skid Row and reminded us that this is a community. That as human beings, we are absolutely brilliant at forming community anywhere. And that the images of God who lived on Skid Row had formed one. And so they had a home. Skid Row was their home and their community. What they didn't have was shelter. What they didn't have was a house. Now, there are definitely people who don't have either. And that's a huge problem. And what Pete reminds me is that it's important for me not to make assumptions about a life that I have never personally experienced. And that's kind of why we're here this morning and why we're starting with today. Probably most of us have heard the statistics. Latest one I saw is that there are more than 47,000 people without shelter, without permanent housing in Los Angeles, and that's enough to fill Dodger Stadium to overflowing. And we know this in our own community. We have people in our own All Saints community who sleep on sidewalks, in doorways, and on the grounds of this church. But just describing someone as homeless or houseless is only talking about one facet of their lives. There are many dimensions to all of our humanity. And there are many dimensions to the poverty that accompanies houselessness, and as many different manifestations of that as there are people who struggle with lack of shelter. So this morning, in this first part, next week is the second part, we're going to look at the human face of houselessness. And we have two wonderful people and friends of All Saints Church who are going to help us with this. First, we have Dorothy Edwards. Dorothy is the Enriched Service Coordinator at Housing Works. The mission of Housing Works is to create housing and service options that model with respect and dignity sustainable, environmentally sensitive, affordable communities with people of limited resources. Dorothy is also on the national board of the Corporation of Supportive Housing. Dorothy has her own story of being houseless or homeless. I'll let you choose how to describe that. And while I imagine you'd probably be the first to say that everyone has their own story, I really think for us hearing your story and the stories of some of the people that you work with are going to be a big help for us this morning. We also have Sofia Herrera. Sofia best describes herself as a contemplative community psychologist. She's a licensed clinical psychologist and a research faculty member at the Graduate School of Psychology over at Fuller Theological Seminary. She's also the associate director of the seminary's Office for Urban Initiatives. She's also the founder of the Institute for Community Psychology, which is one of several community-based and faith-based institutes that partner under the nonprofit, nonpartisan Institute for Urban Initiatives. She's also an associate of the Mount Calvary Benedictine Retreat House and Monastery. And so, much like Becca Stevens, who's been here before, and as Sofia has met with in Thistle Farms, her work is influenced by the Benedictine tradition of hospitality. And Sofia is going to talk with us about the lived experience of houselessness from her perspective as a community psychologist and the people with whom she has been in community. So that's going to be part one today. Next week, we'll have part two. We'll be welcoming John Brower from Union Station, Terry Quigley of Episcopal Communities and Services, and Bill Wong of the City of Pasadena to talk about what's currently being done to address the houselessness crisis in our city and how we can help. But that's next week. Today is about hearing stories and diving as deeply as we can into this lived experience that many, many among us have. And so, Dorothy, with that, I just want to turn it over to you and thank you so much for being here and just invite you to start by sharing a little of your story. So thank you.
Hi, everybody. I get a little nervous, I'm sorry. I came to Pasadena in the year 2000 from a recovery home in Pomona. I was raised in Hacienda Heights in Walnut, but I was always a runaway. When my parents got divorced, they told me choose between which one, and I couldn't do that. So I booked me and my dog and my guitar, and I'm going up the coast, and I never finished school. You know, it was a whole different time back then. So when I came, I was in a recovery home trying to get my life together after a very traumatic experience of being kidnapped and held hostage for 8 months. And I had a lot of PTSD. I had a lot of mental issues. So I had a fight with a girl that was at the recovery home, and we both got kicked out. And my case manager goes, oh, no. And I was ready to go back to the Connections house and start using again. And I had this stuff packed that I was going to take and this stuff I was going to leave. And what I was taking was everything I was going to need to sell to the Connection. And she saw that, and she brought me to Pasadena. And she brought me to Passageways. And I went into a recovery home here, and I stayed clean for 4 years. But I didn't get the mental health help that I needed. And I got into an abusive relationship, and I lived right here on Euclid, right across Walnut there, for 4 years. I worked at Beatles Cafeteria for 4 years, and then when all that started happening, I became homeless again because I didn't want to stay in that abusive relationship anymore. I couldn't go to work. I had black eyes, and I had to quit my job. That was devastating to me. Because I really held my job close to my heart, and all my customers there, they're like a big family, and so I was really broken. So I got out there on the streets, and one of the things about on the streets is if you don't use drugs on the streets, you're sort of outcast away from everybody else because that's their little clique. And the thing is once you start using drugs, you get in so deep that it's just you're winding up in and out of jail and in and out of prison, which I did. I was also on parole when I came to Pasadena. And when I was clean the first time, I got off parole, thanks to my great, my parole officer. But then what happened was I was not using drugs that heavy, but as soon as I hit the streets, I started using because that's what everybody did. And that happens to a lot of people, a lot of kids, people who've never, ever touched drugs in their life. They get out there and they get with those circles of people, and it's inevitable they're going to use. And there's nothing worse than already being down and then kicking yourself down some more. It's not the right way to live. Fortunately for me, after 7 years, I was found by Housing Works, who I work for today, and I owe my life to that agency. I owe my life to, they're my family. The biggest thing they did for me was they came and they did a vulnerability index on me, a VI SPDAT, and then they told me, okay, we're going to put you in the CES. And it was an effort called 100,000 Homes Across America. And so they were looking for the most chronically homeless, most vulnerable, most likely to die on the streets within a year. And out of 20 people in Pasadena, I was number 4. And that says a lot about how bad my addiction was and my lifestyle. It was very risky. I get choppy when I talk about it. It's very emotional for me. So I hid from them after I had a voucher and I didn't trust them, so I hid, and they finally found me and they took me into Housing First with supportive services. And they worked alongside Ann Lansing, Bill Huang, City of Pasadena, with permanent supportive housing voucher. And so that gave me a foundation that I could do something with my life, and I didn't have to run anymore, and I didn't have to run from the kidnapping and run from all those emotions. And that's when I was introduced to Sofia, and she was generous enough to help me out and get me hooked up at Fuller Seminary for therapy. And if it wasn't for that, I would have never, ever got over what I was living through every single day over and over and over. So with that came a new freedom. And I went and I got clean and sober, got 5 years. Yeah. I've been housed for 5.5 years. So I got 5 years. I'm a registered drug and alcohol counselor, woohoo, in the state. And all these amazing things happened, and then so I became an advocate for the people living out there without housing. And like he said, you could build a house with your general population you're hanging with out on the streets. That's your home, because that's your family. But without a roof over your head, there's no telling what tomorrow brings, and there's no stability there, and it's hard to take that next step, that next leap of faith, that you could go further and be better than what you are at that time. So it's because of all that I was able to get my life together and heal, and it's so important. And I was out there, and I had my dog, and he was 6.5 years out there with me on the streets, and I'm so grateful that for the last 5 years, 5.5 years, he was able to live indoors in my home, my dog, and he passed in May, and he passed peacefully. And it wasn't like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I'm going to bury him on the side of the freeway? No, it's not like that. He's in an urn on the mantle in the living room where he needs to be, And, I owe that to everybody here. Just the graciousness that you've all offered me, everybody's offered me. Also, great thing, Wednesday, my sister and her husband are coming from Washington State, and I'm making pineapple upside down cake and a big roast. And then they're going to their 50th high school reunion, and so it's going to be amazing. I haven't seen her for 10 years. And I thank you all for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much, and thanks for the gift of your story. And I want to jump back to you in a second. You did great. Sofia, can you tell us a little bit about community psychology and your work, and also what you've learned from that perspective about the effects of living without shelter?
So community psychology really looks at the interaction of the individual and the environment. And when things are not going well with systems, understanding systems in a community, community psychology seeks to intervene to right the conditions that are not right for the flourishing of people. So that's basically what attracted me in terms of my work in the field of homelessness. Dorothy has so eloquently talked about the experience of people out there on the streets. I think that when we walk around and we see our neighbors who are homeless, oftentimes we forget that they're somebody's sister, somebody's brother, somebody's father, somebody's mother, and that when that person was born, their mother wasn't thinking they're going to be homeless, right? Or the parents were not, or that was not their aspiration when they were young. So there's something about then intervening to correct the situation, to correct a wrong, that we have in our society. And that also comes from the tradition of the social reformers. I think that we stand on the shoulders of social reformers, Martin Luther King with the, Poor People's Campaign, and so many others, Nellie Blythe, and others, Jacob Riis, who started to document the living conditions of people in New York at the beginning of the last century, for example. So in my personal life, I weave my own spirituality, which comes from a Benedictine perspective, and also from Teresa of Avila, which, by the way, her feast is today. And Teresa of Avila is sort of this very mysterious woman. I just don't know how she escaped the Inquisition, I was just saying, and now being proclaimed as a doctor of the church. But she was a social reformer. Right? So we have these great traditions throughout the history of the church that lead us to stand on the shoulders of others, and we have lessons that we don't need to relearn. That we all need to relearn, that we can apply. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And in that sense, weaving community psychology, the interaction of individuals with their environment, with systems, and understanding how systems have failed people. Sometimes we are thinking, and this is more about the trauma-informed care piece that you were asking me about, sometimes we ask people, what's wrong with you, right? But we need to be reframing that with what happened to you, right? And so that's sort of in a nutshell.
No, that's fantastic, and thank you. I found that a very helpful piece of reframing. Of from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, because it centers us on our story, and we're all shaped by what has happened to us. And so, one of the things that was very powerful for me of what you said is it's so easy, and we're really encouraged in our society to other each other, and to remember that across any barrier there is deep commonality. Right. And so, how can we think of, I have a friend in St. Louis who says, let's not talk about homeless people. He said, I have lots of people in my family who have cancer. You don't call them cancer people. Right. But we're people who struggle with cancer. Everyone's struggling with something. And some people are struggling with houselessness or homelessness. And when we can stop othering each other, maybe we can start looking at the reality of each other's existence. And so I want to kind of pop back to you, Dorothy, and say that there are myths that those of us who have never experienced being on the street hear and buy into about that life. And what are some of the What are some of the things that you'd like to tell those of us who have never experienced that? And there are people, I said, there are people in this room who have and are experiencing this. But what are some of the things that you would like to tell us about that life that maybe we don't know and that might explode some myths about living on the street?
That's a good one. I think the most important myth is, where is their family? Where is their family? Why isn't their family helping them? A lot of times when people are addicted to drugs and have drug and alcohol problems, they isolate themselves from their family. They're ashamed, they're humiliated, and they blame themselves, and so they don't contact their family. They stay away from their family. I know I did. That's one thing. Another thing is, oh, they all want to be out there. Who wants to be out there? You know, it's like, and another thing is, oh, they're criminals. Yes, you know, when you're getting arrested because you're sleeping on the sidewalk, I mean, yeah, and now you have a record, yeah, you're a criminal. And with me, they did that to me, and the reason I was on parole was for, I was in somebody's backyard that I shouldn't have been in, and they arrested me for residential burglary, but I had drugs on me. So the residential burglary wouldn't stick, so they got me for drugs, okay? And so when I went to court, I took the deal. I took 2 years for possession for sales because I had 2 baggies. And they said, okay, then we're not going to put the residential burglary on your record. Well, today I have residential burglary on my record and no drug charge. You know, I mean, that's what I'm talking about. That's criminalization. And being homeless, that's what they run on. They run on, oh, you're on drugs. And I said, why did you pull me over? Every time I come out on Colorado Boulevard, you guys hem me up, you know? Oh, well, you know that guy back there that when you walk by, that was in the back of my car? And I go, yeah. He goes, well, he had drugs on him. And I'm like, well, why didn't you take him to jail? That's what you do to me. You know, you know, not everybody's a criminal out there. Not everybody enjoys going into a store and having to steal something to eat. And even now, people who live in housing with their families, they're at that point where they're going into stores and they're taking things to feed their family because they can't afford to feed their family and pay their rent. You know, that's horrible. Yeah.
One of the things in your story that really jumped out at me is the deep trauma you talked about, being kidnapped and held hostage for 8 years. And you also said that, or actually 8 months, excuse me, 8 months. And you also said that, you know, you got into a program, but it didn't really take until you got into the therapeutic work that Sofia offered at Fuller. Can you talk a little more about why that made such a huge difference for you?
There's an old saying, putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. I don't know if anybody's heard that before. But you don't put a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. You go to the hospital, you have that bullet removed, and you get stitched up, and you get antibiotics, and you get everything you need to get healthy again. Recovery places, they don't have that kind of staff. They suggest that you go, but they don't, you know. And all they want usually is money, 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 and it is a big money industry. But I think that it would be good if they incorporated mental health in the housing with the folks.
And so, from your perspective, what is the role of trauma in living with houselessness, and also how does being without a house, not having just even a comfortable bed to sleep in, impact an individual's ability to make and sustain relationships and live in community?
Well, one of the things that I keep hearing, and that I just heard again from you, Dorothy, you're always teaching me about things, is that people may be perhaps traumatized to begin with. They may have experienced some form of abuse in their lives before they became homeless, either when they were growing up or in terms of domestic violence, though the rates are not as high. But the problem is that when you go out and you're out onto the streets, then the story complicates, because then you are exposed to other forms of traumatization. So you can be assaulted on, you can be hit, in so many ways. And when we're talking about trauma and you have a cumulative effect, if you do not address the root of the problem, you're going to be self-medicating all the time, right? You're going to be you're going to be self-medicating all the time. So what Dorothy said is we need to then bring out mental health services into the picture. The problem is that we don't always have those mental health services available, right? Oftentimes, I think the biggest problem in terms of access is that services are not necessarily pro bono, right? Because there's this principle in therapy that you should pay at least a little something to just kind of value that service, right? So, do we have enough therapists who will be willing to be lenient, right, and experts so that we can allow access to those services? And then it requires somebody who is sort of skilled and seasoned in treating trauma, right? Not everybody can treat trauma. So, and it doesn't require necessarily to have a psychoanalytic type of approach. You can be very, very cognitive behavioral therapy that is short-term, but it does wonders in terms of reframing a lot of the things that are happening in that individual's life. So just reframing right now, like I say, what's wrong with you into what happened to you is a big difference, right? And so making that shift also helps a lot. But that is a need. Mental health services are not readily available. There's usually long waiting lists. I can kind of nudge my colleagues at Fuller and say, make room for this person, and they have qualified therapists, right? But if you don't have that, then we need to advocate, for those mental health services. The other thing is that we need to have outreach teams that go out into the street and have sort of a street medicine approach, right, when we're engaging people. And we're engaging them for housing, not for shelter, but for housing. We need to be engaging people for housing. And when we go out into the streets and do that outreach and engagement, we need to understand why somebody may not be responding to you. Systems have failed people in the past. And sometimes we label people as service resistant when the systems have failed them. I'm not saying that people don't commit any behaviors that can get in the way, but if we understand to begin with, if we reframe, if we understand our path to recovery, with a person, that makes a big difference, I believe. And people know when you're genuine, when you are out there and doing some outreach, So it takes a certain kind of person to be in that team, and we really need outreach teams that incorporate mental health services, that incorporate at least a nurse, healthcare services into it, and substance use in recovery specialists. We really need that, We also have the other aspect of people who are on the psychotic spectrum of things. And so people are sometimes hearing all the voices, and on top of that, they have the trauma. So that is a very, very complicated picture. For those individuals, therapy is not going to help, but an intervention in terms of psychiatry will help. So we need psychiatry in outreach teams. As you can see, I don't know if I'm answering your question completely, but it's a complicated question that needs a multidisciplinary approach. And it needs a multidisciplinary type of answer.
So sort of branching off that, one of the things that Becca Stevens says to me all the time is that she's never known a woman who's been on the streets for any length of time who has not been assaulted.
Right.
And I'm seeing both of you nod at that. And so when I think about if that part of trauma, and often repeated trauma, is part of your life, how does that impact someone's ability to do things that maybe someone like me would take for granted, which is even like advocate for themselves or
Right.
even enter into a conversation with someone I don't know?
Right. Your faith in humanity is lost, right? And then you have no reason to trust any of the systems that have failed you before, that have labeled you as service resistant, as I said before. So that's the job of a good outreach worker, is to meet the person where he or she is at, to be able to build gradually on the relationship by being consistent in that trusting relation. That's the only way trust is going to be built. So part of dealing with trauma has to do with establishing a sense of trust with an individual, in being able for that person who is establishing the relationship and the trust to be consistent, over time. That's very key, the consistency over time. That's the only way that a person is going to know that you're there and you're real. You're for real. Because I am so wounded, why shall I trust you?
Dorothy, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to, could I get 2 minutes?
No, go.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking, about the what Sofia's saying and everything, and I'm thinking about the decline of becoming houseless. Okay, so I'm going to give you what happened in my decline. Okay, I went from a girl that wore her hair up every day, put her makeup on every day, had gold jewelry, diamonds, was very on a schedule, very close ties to my community. And, every day in the shower at a certain time, every day leave the house at a certain time, going from that to just the freedom of nothing and having nothing, and especially after fighting so long with my PTSD and all the time I worked at Beatles, even though I had a smile on my face, I was always looking over my back thinking that guy was going to walk in and get me again. And watching the door, and so I went from that person that was always on schedule to the person who is in the dumpster getting cans and bottles, and the guy comes out of the restaurant with a bucket of slosh, and he's going to dump it in, and I pop up, and he looks at me and goes, "Hi, Dorothea, what are you doing in there?" It's my old coworker. If that is so humiliating. Then after that happened, then the arrest, and then the drugs. It all just falls into place. And I went from a person who rode the bus every day, upstanding in the workforce, to a person who's standing on the corner of the freeway, working on bicycles, and not having a bath in a week. I mean, it's devastating enough to get that schedule taken away from you, but not being clean too. It's really, it hits people in their heads and it hits them in their hearts. And it's like, oh my God, how could I do this to myself? Well, I already did it, I'm here. And so then people, they learn to deal with that and they learn to overlook it. And I mean, I've seen people so bad that they haven't showered in like a year, and you could smell them like on the bus. And it's those are the people that we want to get. They're the ones that they say are, how did you say it? The system's broken for them, and right, they're system resistant. Those are the people we really need to get. Because, we don't know, like there's somebody, that, like Sofia said, that's somebody's brother, that's somebody's uncle, that's somebody's aunt, somebody's sister, it's important.
I'd like to open it up here. We have about 10, 12 more minutes. Are there questions for either Sofia or Dorothy? Carlos?
Dorothy, did you know the hippie kitchen when you were downtown?
I'm sorry?
I'm here.
He's right here.
Oh, hi.
Did you know the hippie kitchen when you were downtown?
No.
It's way out on 6th Street. I just wondered if you'd ever visited it.
No, actually, I was homeless here in Pasadena.
Oh, mainly Pasadena?
Yeah, I slept on all the rooftops and the business fronts, all over Pasadena. I had a camp in the 210 freeway by Target. Yeah.
Dorothy, could you tell us more about the 8 months captivity and how you were kidnapped and how did you escape?
So let me first say, as much
That's
as
fine.
you feel comfortable with that.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks to Fuller and Sofia, I'm able to speak about it today. No, I was staying in my friend's garage. I was homeless, houseless, and this guy came over to buy drugs from her, and he goes, "Who's that girl out there?" So I got to know him, and I went with him once to his house. He was cool. The next time he took me over there, he had it all ready for me and had bars on the windows and locks, and he was very abusive. He raped me. He went back to my friends, got my little kitten, brought it over and snapped his neck in front of me. Just did everything he could. He had a grinding wheel in the kitchen on the counter where he just all day sharpened this thing, telling me he was going to stab me with it. And finally I escaped, and when the police saw me, he got arrested for kidnapping, corporal punishment. He was looking at 19 years. They gave him 3 years. Then they paroled him to my parole office, and he was like 3 people ahead of me when I went in there to see my parole officer. And that's what kind of protection I got from the state, It was very scary.
Okay, thank you both. And Dorothy and Sofia, I heard in Dorothy's story that first you got housing and then you were able to get some healing. And I'd like both of you to comment on it. That seems important to me, but I'm not there, is housing first and then
Right.
then you can go into healing.
So housing first is a philosophy and an approach. And it's also a practice that is evidence-based. We know that it works. But it's not just the housing alone. It's the housing plus services with it. And there are home-based services. In the case of Dorothy, Housing Works walked the journey with her all the way and continues to walk the journey with her. So Housing First is really putting people into housing as soon as it is feasibly possible. There are no preconditions for housing. You don't have to prove your sobriety. It's a harm reduction approach. You don't have to earn your housing. It assumes that it's a basic human right. So we know that Housing First works, but we need to scale it up. And that's where we hit the snuggle, right? Because we don't have enough affordable housing. We don't have enough permanent supportive housing in the city. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that in our Launch of Compassion this afternoon is, how do we create a community that says, yes, in my backyard?
I want to add that 5 years ago, the city of Pasadena had a lot of vouchers, a lot of housing, but not a lot of supportive housing vouchers. And today, there's a lot of vouchers, but there's no housing. It's total housing scarcity, housing deprivation, and the not in my backyard mentality. A lot of people, and in some ways it's a little understandable, but I can't see how someone could let someone be struggling in the dirt and living like that when they have something that. I give whatever I have to anybody because I've been there without nothing. I don't give, how does it go? I don't give because I have a lot. I give because I've had nothing. I know what it's like to have nothing.
Yeah. So Housing First works. We know it works. We just need to scale it up. And that's the question for us all. It's not just the city's responsibility. It's not just Union Station's responsibility. It's not just, another Door of Hope's responsibility. It's the community's responsibility.
Can I ask
Yeah, go, yeah, please.
I just want to add, in Housing First, every homeless person costs like $63,000 a year for their hospitalizations, their jail stints, their, just all the stuff at the courts. And Housing First is $17,000. So that right there, it's very money manageable for the city, and I just suggest that people really check into that.
Do I have a minute?
Go for it.
Yeah.
And then one more question in back. Yeah.
Right. So one of the things that I would like us to just kind of note that in the 80s, basically, we had the first kind of obvious wave of homelessness, right, after Reagan. And, that was really a decade of compassion. People were responding with emergency assistance, food and shelter, right? Nothing wrong with that. During the 90s, we have a decade of backlash because none of what we were doing was actually working in getting people off the streets. In the 2000s, we begin finally to think about best practices and how that, how can we start thinking about effective ways, to house individuals. And that's when the research begins to kick in, right? We don't have a long history of research in homelessness. It's up until now, that, clinical trials in terms of, what works in terms of housing, that wasn't there before. It was Samson Barris with Pathways to Housing in New York that first started to look at the model from a more research base. So we know it works. And sadly, congregations, and I'm a person of faith and a PK, pastor's kid too, and once in the process for the priesthood, so I feel free to say this, that we tend to focus on homelessness as a solution in terms of relief. But we do not think about it in terms of development. And that's what we need to be doing, development. Because all of those people that we failed in the 80s, those people are our chronically homeless people today. So do we want to stop this cycle? That's my message to you today.
Crystal, really quick.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for your story, Dorothy. I really appreciate hearing, and blessings to you on your recovery path. This is okay. Quick. I'm still working this question out, but what I'm really walking away with is this tool of reframing the community psychology, because I feel like what I've been learning here in the sermons and in my journey at All Saints is that I am often the community that happens to people. So how am I living my life, right? So like I love that you're giving us a concrete solution with the homeless, the housing, whatever this, what that you were just talking, yeah, housing first. But there's, the system that Dorothy was talking about, the family, the environment that she interacts with. I'm that environment. So I don't really know if I have a question, but it's like, how am I living my life that it happens to people, that this happens to? And so I really appreciate this forum and what you brought to this today, both of you. Thank you.
And any closing? Actually, we've got to, can it wait till afterwards? We have to close so our streamers can leave. So, yes, but I have to. Yeah, so I'm just going to close this out real quick. Thanks. Do you have like any sort of final comments for either one of you? So.
I think I just said my piece.
Okay.
And let's change the language of homelessness.
Amen. Thank you. First of all, can we give a round of applause? Thank you so much both for being here. Are you both able to stay just a few minutes afterwards if there's other questions? I think she had to leave for choir. Also, the Women's Lunch of Compassion is today after the 11:15 service. The theme is No More Homeless Women, so come back for that. And then next week, again, we have folks from Union Station, Episcopal Communities and Services, and the city of Pasadena talking about some of the things that are going on right now. Thank you all very much. Thanks to everyone who is streaming online.